Hi, my name is James. Welcome to King's Fine Woodworking. Today I'm going to show you how to make a 3D end grain cutting board. I'm actually going to include all of the steps from beginning to end, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do it and make it easy and make it perfect. There's a ton of 3D cutting board videos out there showing taking each individual parallelogram piece here, cutting it out of the different colors, and then attempting to glue all 120 of these pieces up together and create the cutting board with it. The problem is you'll never get something like that gap free. The accuracy and precision that's needed is almost impossible to achieve. So I'm going to show you how to do that, how to achieve it perfect accuracy with no gaps at all. It's just a different building technique, and one nice bonus is that it's going to be an end grain cutting board when it's all done. So we're going to start with the lumber that we need, and I have found that walnut, mahogany, and maple make the perfect combination. The darker species, the walnut and the mahogany, need to be 8/4 stock, which is approximately 2 inches thick before milling, and the maple needs to be 4/4 stock, which is approximately an inch before milling. I started by jointing all faces flat on the jointer first, and then switched to the planer to plane the other side down to get it parallel with the first and to get it to the exact thickness that we need. And I have all of the lumber milled, and the exact dimensions for each are in the plans. And you want to periodically check it with the calipers and make sure that you have the thicknesses just right. Now we'll do some glue up. We've got maple at the top and bottom and the dark wood in the middle. I know the maple is wider than it needs to be. I could cut it down, but I'm not really worried about it yet. Normally you would line it up flush with one end, let the excess hang over there, but I'm going to show you a little trick to save some lumber, basically to cut down on the waste. We know we're going to cut at 30 degrees here, which is 30 off the horizontal, which would be 60 off the vertical, but you can see that we're going to have quite a bit of waste if we do that. But if I slide this over before doing a glue up, you got to bear with me here, and make it so that it just barely fits within this angle, and I do the glue up here, then the first bit that I cut off that's going to be waste is going to be a very small amount. And you'll really see how this works and how it saves once we do the first cut. So you just kind of have to trust me at this point. If you have a glue roller of any kind, and this is a really expensive one, but I'll put a link to this, and I'll put a link to a much cheaper one, about a $20 one on Amazon, that also works really, really good. But a glue roller will really help you get this done fast. I like to glue both sides of everything to make sure I have a tight bond. And speaking of tight bond, this does need to be something like a waterproof or very highly water resistant glue like Tite Bond 3. Tite Bond 3 gives you lots of open time. Don't spill it like that, because then your daughters will play with it. They'll just get it all over the place. They don't care. They think it's funny. They like glue, probably even more than I do. Now maybe you don't even need a glue roller. You could just get some kids with some hands and just let them handle the whole thing for you. It'll go fast that way too. All right, so we're going to do the glue up here, and you'll see how I'm going to line these up. I'm going to line them up in the same way that I just showed with that 30, 60, 90 square. I don't want them lined up perfectly on the left-hand side. I want them offset by that angle, because I'm going to trim these down at that angle, and you can see what I've got here. So we're following the angle. Basically, I'm going kind of from corner to corner to corner up, because that gets cut off. And I know you can't quite picture it yet, but you'll see as soon as I make that first cut on the table saw. And of course you do need lots of clamps. And you guys probably know Ryan by now. This is my daughter Kavita, her boyfriend. And he loves woodworking. He helps us in the shop every day. He's very good at it. He's learned quite a bit. That's their dog Joey. He's become a permanent shop dog here as well. And there we go. So I've got the light ones and the dark ones all glued up. And this, what I have here, is the makings of 3 large cutting boards. So you need lots of clamps. If you don't have them, you just glue up a little bit less at a time. No big deal. I let these sit overnight because this is a cutting board. I just want a really good bond. I want it really strong. You could probably let it sit for just a few hours, but I didn't have anything else to do for the rest of that day, so I did let it go ahead and glue up overnight. And now we're going to get to the saw and cut this off. I'm going to use the band saw and I've got that set at my 60-degree angle. And you can see now why I offset those, because the stuff to the left there is the waste. And instead of having lots of waste, I have very, very little waste going off to the left. 3D cutting boards just automatically have lots of waste built into them, so anytime you can minimize it, it's nice, and that's why I've offset that. Not mandatory, but it's nice if you can do that and save a little bit of wood. There's the first slice, and I've got this set up to do the next slice, and so on and so forth. I just moved the fence down the appropriate amount. I'm not worried about how well the bandsaw cuts or how smooth it cuts. If you have a nice wide blade, like a 1/2-inch blade, I have a little bit wider here because I have a bigger bandsaw. It'll cut a little bit smoother, but we are going to plane both sides of this because we've got to get this cut down perfectly smooth for the next glue up. But we're going to go ahead and cut these all into slices. Now I have these composition boards here made up of, some of them have mahogany in the middle and some of them have walnut in the middle. And remember, the middle boards are the dark boards, and they're always thicker than the outside boards, which will be the light boards, and I've used maple in this case here. Once that's done, I've got them all set up here. These are like big parallelograms now. That's what it looks like, and you can see the bandsaw cuts aren't perfect, but like I said, that's no problem. We are going to take these over to the planer, and we're going to plane them down. I'm not going to plane off much, just enough to make these things perfect. Pencil marks on both sides before I joint and plane will help me ensure that both sides have been thoroughly milled and I don't have sections that I've missed. And I do want to keep them parallel, so I'm going to joint one side first. That basically gets it flat. Or I guess Ryan's going to joint one side first. I'm going to talk. So he'll joint one side of each of those first and get it flat, and then we'll switch to planer mode on this machine and we'll plane the other side down. That, here it is there, that's going to bring it into parallel with the top side. That's really important. You always joint one face and then you plane the second face. That gets your milled wood into perfect parallel from the top to the bottom. If anybody is interested in the plans for this project, I will put a link to the plans in the description of the video below, and there will be the plans, plus I will go ahead and include the original SketchUp file in case you want to change it, make it bigger, smaller, wider, thicker, whatever you like there. But the plans will work without the SketchUp also, so you don't have to be a SketchUp expert. Now we want to turn this parallelogram shape into a rectangle by cutting the outer triangles off. We're going to come right to the very bottom of the maple, because I want the maple to still come right to the bottom at that peak, and we're just going to cut straight up vertically. It's going to look something like this, and I've got a square here that I've used to mark it, and you can see the maple goes all the way to the bottom and all the way to the top, and this is the part that we're going to be removing. So we'll set that up with the table saw fence, and you see as I'm cutting it there, hopefully you can see what's happening, but we are keeping all of the maple all the way down to the very bottom. And so we're going to go ahead and cut both sides of this off and turn it into a rectangle. There's one side, and we'll adjust the fence and do the other side. And those little triangles that are coming off are also waste. Unfortunately, there's, like I mentioned, definitely some waste when you're doing a 3D cutting board. That's probably why you can charge a big premium for those if you like to make cutting boards and sell them. And here they are, all cut. We haven't trimmed the ends yet. That'll happen much, much later. But now that they're cut, we're going to take them and we're going to flatten one face and then joint the other. Once again, I want to mark it with my pencil so that I can make sure that I get all of the material off of that edge. And it is a little rough coming out of the saw, so we want to make sure that it is all covered. And we've flattened the top on the jointer above, and then we're going to flip it over and we are going to plane the bottom. And we're going to plane a specific amount off, and you can see as we're planing down, we're losing some maple. We haven't lost any off of this side yet, but we're going to lose some maple, and some of the mahogany is going to be showing through like that. So you might think, oh no, we've planed it too far, but you haven't. So we made it perfect to begin with, specifically so that we could plane some of it off. And you can see here in the plans that it's planed off. And when I join it together here, you can see, if you look down there at the bottoms and at the tops, you can see that some of the hardwood, or sorry, the dark wood is actually coming down further than the maple. And that's okay, because when we're done with this next glue up, we're going to plane the tops and bottoms, and that's going to get rid of those. If it doesn't make sense yet, just hang on for a moment, and it'll all make sense once we start milling this down. So we're going to go ahead and glue this up. And you have to follow the same pattern that I have in the plan for the glue up. And it's important that all these boards are at the same height. You don't want some higher and some lower. So take care to make sure that they're at the same altitude when you do this. One thing you can do, and I recommend doing, is putting cauls. A caul is spelled C-A-U-L, in case you didn't hear exactly what I said. But if you put cauls on top and bottom of each end, that will hold the boards flat in the correct orientation. So one of them can't slide up or slide down or anything like that. It's important to keep them as flat as possible at this point. Now when I put the cauls on, I put them on both sides, but I just put them on sort of loose. I don't squeeze these clamps as hard as I can yet. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. If I squeeze them together as hard as I could, I may have problems with the parallel clamps trying to force them together from side to side. So I'm just going to put the cauls on with the squeeze clamps here, sort of a medium tight, so that I can still force the boards together if they're not fully snug. A lot of glue ups that you do can benefit from using cauls. For cauls, I typically use a softwood like maple. I'm sorry, softwood like a pine 2x4. That way when I knock it off, if there's glue on it, it'll tend to tear out the softwood and not my hardwood. So there's that, and it is now fully clamped down tight, and we have done it with all of them, and they are over there drying. Once again, I'm going to leave these to dry overnight and then pull off all the clamps. And now they're all in a nice, neat array there, and I followed the pattern from the cutting board. I use a scraper, any kind of scraper will do, and try to get the bulk of the extra glue off. This will get it flatter so I can get it over to the planer, and there's no big bumps of glue that are holding it up high and on one side and not the other. We'll get it as flat as we can. You can use a card scraper, you can use a chisel. Now this one is a little bit too big to go on a jointer on top, a little bit too wide, so we're just going to plane both sides. And you see, as we're planing, we're getting rid of that extra bit of dark wood that showed through from the previous planing. So the previous one made it look like we were taking off too much, but now we're going to bring it back down into the correct proportion by jointing, or planing, sorry, both sides, top and bottom, are alternating back and forth to get it down to perfect. So the maple, once again, will come right up to the peak. Once that's done, we want to take it over to a sled and cut off the excess. Sled's critically important here. You could do it without, of course, but a sled will really make a difference. This is our sled, our Flagship table saw sled. If you happen to be in need of a sled, now you can see how the maple does come back to the peaks. If you don't have a sled, you can, of course, use your table saw. It just won't be quite as accurate. You're more prone to having burns and more prone to having tear out, which means a lot more sanding and a lot more work at the end to finish it. So I'm kind of showing it both ways, but if you have a sled, that'd be the way to do it. If you are in the market for a sled, take a look at our plans or our video. I'll put a link down below in the description, and you can check out ours. You can make one if you like. We even sell them pre-made, so if you want to buy one, that's handy too. And the Flagship sled that we have does a lot. It does crosscuts, miters, picture frames, everything. All right, so this is it coming off of the saw. And then we're going to rotate every other piece 180 degrees. And that's going to bring out the pattern. And you'll see the pattern start to emerge. And that will be how we glue it all up. All right, there we go. And once we get them pulled into the right order, you can see that that lines them up just right. And that's our pattern. And you'll notice there's no gaps anywhere, no gaps at all, because of the way in which we built it. That's important. So I'm going to bring these down and apply glue to these faces. We always try to be educational in our approach and make woodworking easier and more understandable. And if you like this type of content and you enjoy this video or any of our other videos, we would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to our channel. It's how we grow the channel, and it's really our primary source of income. So anytime someone subscribes, it really helps us out. Once they're all glued, we will put them up into the clamp, and I like to put a little blank piece before that, just a piece of scrap wood, so that I don't put any dents in my wood with the clamp. And we'll get them all in place and lined up. And now it's especially critical that you make sure that the alignment is correct. You want to push these back and forth and up and down as needed, just to make sure that your pattern lines up really nice. I like to start with putting very light pressure on all of the clamps. That makes it easy to tap them into place and you kind of get them where you need them. And then in this case, I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of wax paper down before I put the cauls on the two ends. And that way I can use a hardwood caul because I'm kind of clamping over a longer distance, and I don't have to worry about if glue sticks to it, breaking off glue from the surface of my wood. Once the cauls are in place, then I will go ahead and clamp the parallel clamps down tight, making sure the pattern is, of course, still lined up. Then we'll tighten the cauls and get them all done the same way. And we're going to let these dry overnight as well. After sitting overnight, we pulled out of the clamps, and that is when, right in the middle of the screen, a little tiny shop dog popped up to see what we were doing. She's very curious, and she needs to know at all times what's happening. I want to give a shout out to the people in our Kings Find Woodworking community on Facebook. If you're a Facebook member, you might consider joining the group. It is a private group. It's woodworkers only. And there you can submit your work to show it off. You can ask questions. You can see what projects other people have done. You can get help with anything that you're doing. It's a good community there, and I'll put a link to that in the description as well. Now that we're out of the clamps, we want to take the extra glue off. Now, this is a paint scraper, a cabinet scraper. I first saw this style of scraper when Norm Abram was using it on New Yankee Workshop. And it's a great scraper. It works really well to take the glue off. I'll put a link to this also in the description in case you need something like this, but there are a lot of tools that would work. I just happen to like this a lot. We want to get all the extra glue off, and then we want to hit it with a sander. So we have two choices when it comes to sanding. We can run it through a drum sander, which I happen to have one, so I will use that. If you don't have one, don't panic. Not a big deal. A belt sander, a handheld belt sander, will work great. You could use a random orbit sander, but since it's in grain, it will take you a very long time to sand. It's much better to use something like a belt sander if you're doing it by hand, and just keep marking the surface with a pencil and then sanding off your pencil marks and repeat. Then you'll get down to a nice smooth level finish. And when the belt sanding work is done, then you can switch to a random orbit to get the surface nice and smooth. But like I said, I do have a drum sander, and so we're going to go ahead and use this. It makes quick work of it. I think it took about 3 or 4 passes on each side. We just take off very light passes to get all of the marks off. And then I will take it back over to my sled. This is the table saw sled I talked about, our Flagship sled. The nice thing about this sled is the back fence comes off, so I can cut pieces of any width. I'm not limited by the size of the sled. And this is how I'm going to square up the two edges of this sled. And this thing has 0 clearance inserts on the sled, so I'm not going to have any tear out on the bottom as this cuts through and gets it squared off nicely. There's obviously some glue that always sticks out, squeezes out the edges, and so I'm taking off that glue and getting a nice square even edge there. And we'll flip it and do the same thing to the other side. But you can see what it looks like there. Makes a nice, neat, really good finish. That's why a sled is so valuable, I think. All right, once we have it squared up on all four sides, I like to mark the whole surface with a pencil. That makes sure that I don't sand too much in any one area. So I'm just going to sand it with very light pressure, not much more than the weight of the sander, starting with aggressive paper, and work our way down to very fine grits until we have a smooth finish. Now I want to put a small finger groove on each side. I am using a 3/4 inch diameter core box bit, and I've set up some stop blocks that are equidistant from that core box bit on both sides, far enough apart to gives me where it gives me a groove that's the width that I like. It doesn't have to be exact, and I've set the fence back enough so that the core box bit is cutting into the middle of the board. So it's really a relatively easy setup. I just plunge the board down over it slowly, go back and forth a couple of times, and lift off slowly, and we've got a nice groove. So that's really all there is to that. If you want to make it a little deeper, you can. A little shallower, you can. Then I'm going to go with a very small radius roundover on both sides of the board, kind of to take the edges off so we don't have any chip out in the future. And then once that's done, we will take the random orbit again with a fine grit, and we'll sand over all of those to make those things a little bit smooth. And you definitely want to take the time to sand out inside of these grooves. You're always going to get burns at the ends. If the burns are bad, you could actually elevate that core box bit just a fraction more, like a 1/16 of an inch or less, and do one more cut, and that'll eliminate a lot. But other than that, you really just need to fold up a piece of sandpaper and go to town. Don't take such a beautiful board like this and leave it with burns in these grooves. You got to take the time to get those out. That will really make the whole thing look professional. When that's done and the sanding is done, I like to raise the grain a little bit by spraying on some water. We'll let the water dry, and that will puff up the grain, the surface of the grain, the bits that are loose, and we will sand those off. And I'll end up doing that probably a couple of times, and that makes it ultimately a little bit smoother. If you're in a hurry, you can use your air gun and dry them off. That way they'll dry off just a touch faster. And that way, when your board gets washed later in the future, inevitably, even though you have oil and paste wax finish, or wax finish, it's going to end up raising the grain a little bit, but that won't make any difference if you have bothered to go through and raise the grain and sand it back off beforehand. And your board will stay nice and smooth forever. Okay, now the fun part, the best part of building these cutting boards is applying the mineral oil. Some people have a big tank and they can dunk the whole board in it. If you're building boards professionally, you may have something like that. I don't I don't really build them professionally. I just build them occasionally, and so I just pour it on and wipe it around. So I want to make sure that it's thoroughly coated everywhere. And if it soaks in, I'll add a little bit more. And remember, this is end grain, and so a lot is going to soak in on the top and bottom of the board, and that's okay. You can see it's already starting to dry in some spots, and it just keeps wicking that oil in. No problem, just keep adding some more oil. When it stops wicking the oil in, it's done. You can see it's actually pulled the oil all the way through the board. This wood's very porous, and it's pulled it all the way through the board, which is fine. There's no harm there. But we'll flip it over to the other side. And I've got it on some standoffs, some little triangular painter's standoffs to keep it elevated off of the tabletop. And it's sitting on top of a Rockler silicone mat so I don't get oil on my table. This is food-grade mineral oil. That's what you should be using for all of your boards. It's the best product for this. So we'll let this sit until it's done soaking in, and then we will wipe off the excess. If it's not 100% done soaking in, that's okay. As long as it's pretty much not soaking in anymore, then it's going to be just fine. Once that's done, the next step is an oil and wax finish. So we're going to melt down some beeswax. This is food grade beeswax, so it's been cleaned. And we're going to melt this down, and we're going to add mineral oil to this. And collectively, that's going to be the finish that we put over the top of the board. This is going to protect the surface of the board and make it much more waterproof. When it's dry and cooled down, it should have the consistency of a really thin wax. Sometimes this takes about 3 times as much mineral oil as it takes in beeswax. You can experiment with different mixtures. I may have a little bit too much wax here, but that really doesn't matter. You can just keep rubbing it in. It'll rub in just fine. And then we'll buff it off when we're all done wiping it in. And this is kind of the first layer, the first barrier of moisture protection for the board. And that's it. And you can make this cutting board conditioner. I even sell it on the website myself, or you can certainly make your own. And that wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.